Welcome to our teachings this week. We are in a new semester, we are in a new year. Happy Diwali, and thank you for being part of our family, and I hope all of you are doing the metta meditation with us. It's so powerful. I'm only asking you to do this because I know it will change your lives, and I know that it will change the vibration of the people that you love in our communities, so thank you. We're reading the book, The Wise Heart by Jack Kornfield this semester, which is, I've had this book for a long time, and this week we're reading chapter 1, and I just remember how much I love just the first chapter. It's one of these books that you're going to read, you're going to think about, you're going to want to tell your partners or your friends about, and you can put it away after 10 minutes of reading and just not have to pick it up till the next day or a couple days later and just let it fill your cup. It's so beautiful. So the first chapter on nobility, I'd like to ask all of you to read page 12 to 20. Super simple, right? Not making big requests of any of us, including myself. I know your lives are busy. These 12 pages start with so many stories I've told over the years. The first one is the story of the Golden Buddha, which is actually a true story in Thailand of the Buddha that had been covered with resin and just moss and muck from years and years and years, and different people tell the story differently, but basically they discovered one time as there was a chip in the resin that there was gold underneath, and discovered that it was indeed an incredible golden Buddha. And it had been covered years ago when there was wars and they were worried about someone either stealing or breaking the Buddha. So the teaching on nobility, then we use oftentimes a golden Buddha to talk about the fact that we are all golden within ourselves, but that we put resin and different things on top of us in the different years of living and suffering and surviving and all the baggage that we take and carry with us from year to year, that we oftentimes forget that we are in fact golden. And that is the great teachings of the Buddha for all of us, is that we can awaken to our golden self. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So in the first part of this chapter, he discusses this idea of that we have a choice, and that every day of our lives we're making a million little choices whether to acknowledge our golden self or to continue to put stuff on ourselves and be a little dulled to what is most precious in our lives. And he uses an example that we have, again, used in our studies for years with one of my favorite spiritual leaders is Viktor Frankl, and talks about how when things were at their hardest, and he was the sole survivor of his family in the concentration camp, that he remembers noble people that were still able to see their goldenness and live their goldenness, that would go to the huts and try to encourage people and give them their last piece of bread. And I love this so much. I was remembering when we were studying Man's Search for Meaning, and there was a completely different story where Viktor Frankl talks about one of the guards who had shown him a little bit of kindness, and one day he saved bread from his own breakfast and had given it secretly to Viktor Frankl. And he said for him it was more than the act of nourishment that day and having a little bit of bread, but for him it was the act of humanity, that for him that one act of generosity gave Viktor so much hope to survive and to live, that people still were loving and caring. And so I love when we use Viktor as an example of how each of us throughout our days have these opportunities to be loving and kind, not only to ourselves and find our goldenness for ourselves, but that also we have the ability so many times throughout the day to extend that goldenness, that kindness, that compassion we're talking about to one other person. And oftentimes it's just the simplest act that does that. And I would love to read this whole chapter to you, but of course I would cry because there's a story in here I love very much that always makes me a little bit weepy. But just to tell you my version of this story, and hopefully not get too weepy, is a story of a school teacher. And he was saying how she knew and understood this goldenness. And on one day when it was just a rainy day and the kids' spirits were down and they had to take a test, she decided to have them put their books away and stop, and she put every kid's name on the chalkboard. And there was over 20 kids in the classroom. And she said, I want you to get out a piece of paper and I want you to write every name on that piece of paper. And the kids did. And then she said, I want you to write now behind every name something you love or like, or I forget how she said it, admire about that person. And they did. And just that act alone, you can imagine, just raises a vibration when you start thinking of why I like tea, why I like Karen, she's sitting outside. And then she collected the papers and never said anything about it again for about 3 months, until there was another day when it was just a poopy day. And she decided to hand out these pieces of paper that she had wrote on the top the kid's name, and then she had cut and pasted each thing that every kid had said about that person. Fast forward, this was a very loved teacher, you can imagine, and a lot of the kids stayed in touch with her. And one of the mothers reached out to her when her son had died in the Gulf War. And she wanted her to come to the service. And of course, in the service, the teacher was mentioned. And after the service, the mother came up to the teacher and she pulled out of her pocket the piece of paper, which was all folded up and crumpled. And, you could just see it was worn with many times of opening and closing and opening and closing. And she said, this was in my son's pocket when they found his body and brought this back to me. Other students were there for the memorial service, and another student, a girl, pulled hers out of her purse, looking the same, very worn and tattered. And another student said, I had mine read at my wedding. And it was just such a beautiful story for all of us to think of how one teacher, just one act on a rainy day, said, I have this idea to do something that will really boost all of us up in our goldenness, how we feel about ourselves. In this chapter also, they talk about the Dalai Lama, of course, and how he, wherever he went, would make a point of stopping and making a connection to people. So when he'd be at a hotel, I always remember this, when the people that were guarding him would try to shuffle him along to get him out and into the next place. He would want to stop. And as someone was remembering this time when all of the maids and people that were the service folks at this hotel were waiting to say goodbye to him, because he treated them so special while they were there. And as they were trying to shovel him along, the Dalai Lama stopped, and he touched each person and held their hands and thanked them. Another story of when he was here in the United States for something, and he had these bodyguards watching him that had watched presidents and kings and princes and famous people. And they said, again, that the Dalai Lama was their favorite person to guard. And they wanted their picture taken with him. And people said, why is he your favorite? And of course, everyone said the same thing, because he made me feel special. And I think that's our takeaway today, is that is our goldenness. When whatever it is in our life that we're doing, wherever we find ourselves, at a grocery store, or opportunity with a friend, a perfect stranger, how can we give that last piece of bread, or give that piece of bread that winds up nourishing another person and possibly changing their life, changing their day? So here's your quote. That's one of my favorites, but Jack put it in context that I really liked for all of us. He said, the psychologist Viktor Frankl was the sole member of his family to survive the Nazi death camps. Nevertheless, he found a path of healing in spite of this suffering. Frankl wrote, we who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's way. So we're reminded of, after talking about last week, the sufferings we had and all of us continue to have in our lives. Holding each other up as a community means we hold the sufferings up as much as we hold the joys. And just to know that in that there's always this freedom, this liberation, that we can choose our golden self and show up and be not only loving and kind to ourselves, but to take the opportunity to do that to others. As always, I invite all of you to join us, not only in the teachings, but letting these teachings make a difference in your days. Namaste.